When a professor's words became too harsh, an unexpected voice spoke out and left the world talking. The lecture hall buzzed with energy as students filed in, some clutching notebooks, others balancing coffee cups. It was just another Tuesday at Whitmore University, a prestigious campus nestled in the heart of Oregon. Inside room 302, a class on cultural criticism was about to begin, taught by none other than Professor Eleanor Grayson, a name that sparked admiration and controversy in equal measure. Known for her fearless critiques and unfiltered opinions, Grayson had a reputation for pushing boundaries, often using public figures as examples to dissect societal norms. Seated in the third row, blending into the sea of eager faces, was a young man few would have recognized. Tall and poised, with a quiet demeanor that betrayed his keen observation, Barron Trump sat unnoticed. He wore a plain hoodie and jeans, keeping his head slightly down, as if trying to avoid drawing attention. His presence wasn't a coincidence. Barron had enrolled in the university under an assumed name, hoping for anonymity. Despite his family's prominence, he craved a normal life, one where he could think for himself without the shadow of his last name looming over him. As students settled into their seats, Professor Grayson strode to the podium, her commanding presence silencing the murmurs almost immediately. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice crisp and confident. "Today we're diving into the concept of public image, how it's constructed, manipulated, and sometimes weaponized. And we'll be using some real-life examples." Barron shifted in his seat, his expression neutral. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he could already feel the weight of the moment. But what followed would shake the room and him in ways no one could have predicted. Professor Eleanor Grayson wasn't just a lecturer. She was a force of nature. With a doctorate from Stanford and a prolific career in cultural analysis, she had built a reputation for her fearless takedowns of societal hypocrisy. Her lectures often went viral, shared as both brilliant critiques and polarizing rants. Students packed her classes, eager for the intellectual fireworks she promised. Today seemed no different. As Grayson began, she wove through examples of influential figures, deftly analyzing the contrast between their public personas and the realities lurking beneath. She was captivating, her words sharp and deliberate. Yet it wasn't long before her tone shifted, and she introduced a name that caught Barron's attention instantly. "Take Melania Trump, for instance," she said, pacing the stage with the confidence of someone completely in command. "A woman celebrated for her elegance and poise, yet what does that say about our collective standards? Are we so shallow that beauty and silence become virtues worth celebrating?" A murmur rippled through the class. Some nodded, others exchanged wary glances. Barron felt a subtle tightening in his chest but kept his face impassive. Grayson continued, her words now dripping with sarcasm. "What about intelligence, contribution, influence through substance rather than surface? Is this truly the image we want to hold up for young women today?" Barron stared at the desk in front of him, his mind racing. He had attended the lecture out of genuine curiosity about the world of academia and intellectual discourse. But now he felt an unease creeping in, not because he disagreed entirely with the concept, but because of how personal it felt. His classmates seemed entranced, some even chuckling at Grayson's quips. She had a way of making her words feel like gospel, and the room leaned into her critique. But for Barron, this wasn't just a lesson, it was a challenge. A line had been crossed, and he wasn't sure he could let it slide. Professor Grayson didn't stop there. She circled back to Melania Trump, dissecting her every move, from her choice of words during public speeches to her infamous jacket that read, "I really don't care, do you?" The students in the lecture hall leaned in, captivated by her razor-sharp commentary. "She's a symbol," Grayson declared, gesturing for emphasis. "But a symbol of what? Of a bygone era when women were expected to stand silently behind powerful men, to smile prettily and say nothing of substance?" Some students laughed. Others murmured in agreement. The energy in the room grew charged as Grayson leaned harder into her critique. "It's fascinating," she added, her voice taking on a mocking edge. "How easily we mistake quietness for grace and compliance for class. What message are we sending to the next generation?" Barron's hands tightened into fists beneath the desk. The professor wasn't just criticizing a public figure. She was targeting his mother. For years, he had watched Melania endure judgment and ridicule. People saw only her image, her past as a model, or her accent, and used it as fodder for their assumptions. But to him, she was more than that. A fiercely private, intelligent woman who had protected her family with quiet strength. Grayson's words felt like an attack, not just on his mother, but on the values she represented. "What if," she continued, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "we celebrated women who actually made a difference, instead of those who simply wore designer gowns?" The class erupted in laughter this time, and Barron felt a sharp pang in his chest. He scanned the faces of his peers. Some were amused, others indifferent, but none seemed to question the one-sidedness of the argument. And yet, he stayed silent. For now, he wasn't sure if it was fear, respect for the professor, or the weight of being in an environment where his family name was likely unwelcome. But deep down, a spark of resolve began to burn. But Grayson didn't stop there, and as her words grew harsher, so did Barron's determination to speak up. Grayson's voice carried on, each word cutting deeper. "Let's not forget the irony," she said, turning toward the class with a faint smirk. "A woman whose public statements are scarce but include phrases like, 'be best,' a slogan so grammatically awkward it makes you wonder, does it reflect a lack of understanding or a lack of care?" The class erupted again, the laughter louder this time. Barron felt his face flush, his heart pounding against his ribcage. It wasn't anger. It was something more complex. Disappointment. Frustration. The realization that for all her intelligence, Professor Grayson was using her platform to humiliate someone who wasn't there to defend themselves. His mind raced through the lessons his parents had drilled into him. Always stay composed, never escalate, and let actions speak louder than words. But this wasn't a moment for silence. For years, Barron had stayed out of the spotlight, letting his family shoulder the public's opinions, critiques, and sometimes outright hostility. Yet now, sitting in that room, he felt a responsibility, not just to his mother, but to the concept of fairness itself. He took a deep breath, his hand steadying on the desk. Slowly, he raised his hand. It wasn't dramatic or rushed. It was calm, deliberate, almost as if time itself had slowed down. The professor paused mid-sentence, her gaze narrowing as she spotted him. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped, as though annoyed by the interruption. Barron stood, his movements graceful but firm. The room fell silent, every pair of eyes turning toward him. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a palpable curiosity. No one recognized him yet, but his commanding presence seemed to demand attention. "I think you're missing something important," he said, his voice steady, each word clear and deliberate. There was no anger in his tone, no defensive edge, just a quiet confidence that made everyone lean in a little closer. But as his words began to flow, it became clear that Baron Trump wasn't just defending his mother, he was redefining the entire conversation. Barron's voice carried through the room, steady but unyielding. "You talk about my mother as if she's just an image, a caricature of what society wants her to be. But have you ever stopped to consider the humanity behind the headlines?" The professor blinked, caught off guard by the interruption. A few students exchanged glances, unsure of where this was going. Still, Barron pressed on, his tone measured but firm. "My mother grew up in a small town in Slovenia, in a family that didn't have much. She worked hard to make something of herself, navigating a world where people judged her for everything, her accent, her looks, her past. And yet, she succeeded. She became a model, learned 5 languages, and eventually became the First Lady of the United States. Not because she sought fame or power, but because she believed in her family and her values." A murmur rippled through the room. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others leaned forward, drawn in by the unexpected depth of his words. Barron's voice never wavered, his gaze locked on Professor Grayson. "You say she represents outdated ideals, but maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's how we, as a society, decide what's worth celebrating. You criticize her for being quiet, but isn't there strength in choosing your words carefully, In speaking only when you have something meaningful to say? The room was utterly silent now, the weight of his words settling over the students like a heavy blanket. Even Grayson, known for her quick rebuttals, seemed momentarily stunned. And let's not pretend, Barron continued, that public figures like my mother don't pay a price for everything they do. Every smile, every gesture, every mistake is dissected, mocked, and judged by people who've never walked a day in their shoes. We're quick to tear people down, but slow to consider the cost of living under that microscope. He paused, letting the room absorb his words. For the first time, the students saw not just a classmate, but someone who carried the weight of experiences they could barely comprehend. But Barron wasn't finished yet. What came next would challenge not just the professor, but everyone in the room to think differently. For a moment, the room felt suspended in time, as if everyone was collectively holding their breath. Then, a faint shuffle of papers broke the silence, followed by the soft hum of whispered reactions. Some students sat frozen, their eyes wide with surprise, while others exchanged glances that ranged from impressed to uneasy. Barron's words had cut through the noise in a way no one had anticipated. Professor Grayson, typically quick to retake control, hesitated. Her confident demeanor faltered for just a second before she composed herself. "Those are compelling points," she said, her tone measured but tinged with defensiveness. "But isn't it fair to scrutinize public figures, especially when they occupy roles that influence millions?" Barron nodded, his expression calm. "It's fair to scrutinize actions, but what you're doing isn't scrutiny. It's mockery. It's easy to judge someone based on what you see from the outside, but it's harder to understand their full story. What if we shifted the conversation to the values behind the image instead of tearing down the person?" The professor opened her mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. A few students started clapping, a tentative sound at first, then growing louder. One by one, others joined in, until the room was filled with applause. The sound was more than just approval. It was a release of tension, an acknowledgement that something extraordinary had just happened. A student in the back raised his hand. "I never thought about it like that," he admitted. "Maybe we are too quick to judge people we don't know." Another chimed in. "Yeah, it's easy to point fingers, but we forget that public figures are still human beings." The ripple effect of Barron's words was undeniable. Grayson, now standing silent at the podium, glanced around the room. It was clear that the dynamic had shifted. What began as her lecture had turned into a conversation, a real, raw exchange of ideas that she hadn't entirely anticipated. Barron sat down quietly, his presence no longer anonymous. He didn't smile or revel in the attention. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost pensive, as the applause died down. But this moment wasn't just about applause. It was about the lasting impression Barron's response would leave on everyone in the room. The lecture ended, but the energy in the room lingered like an aftershock. Students gathered their belongings slowly, whispering to each other as they replayed the exchange in their minds. For many, it was the first time they had seen someone challenge Professor Grayson in a way that didn't feel combative, but instead, transformative. Barron quietly packed his bag, keeping his head down. A few students approached him hesitantly. "Hey, that was brave," one of them said, her voice tinged with admiration. "You really made me think differently about things." He smiled faintly, nodding in acknowledgement. He didn't say much. He wasn't there to bask in praise. His goal wasn't to win an argument. It was to shift the conversation. And judging by the hushed discussions around him, he had succeeded. Meanwhile, Professor Grayson remained at the podium, flipping through her notes as if searching for something to ground her. A few students approached her with questions, but even she seemed less sure-footed than usual. As she walked out of the lecture hall, her expression was one of contemplation rather than triumph. The impact of the moment didn't stop at the classroom doors. Later that day, snippets of the exchange began circulating on social media. A student had recorded part of Barron's response and shared it online with the caption, "When the quietest person in the room changes everything." Within hours, the clip gained traction, sparking debates in comment sections about respect, public perception, and the power of standing up for what you believe in. Across campus, students debated what had happened. Was Grayson out of line? Was Barron right to speak up? For the first time in a while, the focus wasn't on gossip or superficial matters. It was on meaningful dialogue about values, judgment, and humanity. Professor Grayson, known for her stubbornness, found herself replaying Barron's words in her mind long after the lecture had ended. That evening, as she prepared for her next class, she paused, staring at her notes. Something about her usual approach felt off now, hollow even. For all her critiques of public figures, she realized, she had overlooked an essential truth. Compassion isn't weakness, it's a strength. But this was only the beginning. What started as a single moment in a lecture hall was about to ripple far beyond the university's walls. A week later, the lecture hall was buzzing again. But this time, the energy was different. Students arrived early, filling the seats and chatting in hushed tones about the previous week's confrontation. Professor Grayson stood at the podium, her usual commanding presence tempered with a newfound humility. She opened the lecture by addressing the moment that had clearly left its mark. Last week, something remarkable happened in this room. She began, her voice steady but reflective. I was challenged in a way that made me reconsider not just my arguments, but my approach to teaching. And for that, I owe all of you, especially one of you, she glanced briefly toward Barron, my gratitude. The room was silent, captivated by her unexpected candor. Criticism is important, she continued, but so is understanding. We can't truly analyze or challenge societal norms without empathy. Last week, I failed to extend that empathy to the subject of my critique. For that, I apologize. Barron, seated in his usual spot, offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. He didn't need a grand gesture. The shift in tone was enough. The events of that day didn't just end in the classroom. They sparked a broader discussion across campus about how we engage with ideas, public figures, and each other. Students began questioning not just the subjects of their debates, but the way they approached them. Social media lit up with conversations about the importance of fairness and respect, even in criticism. For Barron, life went on quietly, just as he preferred. He returned to his studies, avoiding the spotlight as much as he could. But his actions had left an indelible mark. Without intending to, he had taught a lesson that transcended any lecture. A lesson about standing up for what you believe in, not with anger or defensiveness, but with grace and conviction. The story carried a powerful moral. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, it takes courage to stand up for fairness and humanity. Respect doesn't diminish critical thought. It enhances it, reminding us that even in disagreement, we can choose compassion over mockery. As the semester unfolded, the students who witnessed that moment carried its message with them. And the ripple effect continued to spread, far beyond Whitmore University. So the next time you're faced with a moment of judgment, pause and ask yourself, are you challenging the idea, or are you tearing down the person? If this story resonated with you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories. Let's keep the conversation going.